Ballet, an art form most often associated with ideas of grace, elegance, and perfection. But how exactly did ballet develop this reputation? And how are contemporary works from the 21st century straying away from this idea? Let's first take a look at the origins of ballet. While the beginnings of the art form were first seen in the aristocratic courts of Italy during the 16th century, it did not really resemble what we now consider to be ballet until it was introduced in France. During the reign of Louis XIV, Louis took the initiative to codify the dance form, solidifying foundational positions still used today, and establishing the first ballet school, Académie Royale de Danse. This foundational development of ballet occurred at the same time that many theorists were arguing a new theory to understand the relationship between our reality and art, the theory of verisimilitude. A notable voice on the subject is one of Charles Bateau. In his work, The Fine Arts Reduced to a Single Principle, Bateau argued that all art is based on the imitation of nature. However, Bateau deviates from earlier ideas about how mimesis works, like those of Plato and Aristotle. Instead of simply holding a mirror up to nature, artists have the responsibility to use nature and transform it, beautifying it. He argued that the goal of the fine arts is pleasure, which could be achieved by deviating away from imitating nature realistically in exchange for aesthetics. Bateau supports this claim with his notion of belle nature, or beautiful nature. This idea gives artists the room to imitate reality in a way that also idealizes it, combining all of the beautiful aspects. Now, what does this have to do with ballet? Well, a closer look at the foundation of ballet technique and storytelling will show us exactly how the art form was also influenced by the theory of verisimilitude. Let's first look at the technique. Ballet has always emphasized the necessity of turnout, where a dancer's hips are rotated outwardly in the hip sockets, having the legs face side instead of front. This position allows for an increase in the hips' range of motion. From a completely physical aspect, it seems logical to use turnout as a way to more easily execute demanding movement, but it also plays an aesthetic role. Increasing one's range of motion is taking the natural movement of the body and idealizing it, taking it one step further by imagining something even better than the natural and striving for this more beautiful imitation. Turnout also exemplifies this idealization by its use in the launching and landing of jumps. Physically, a turned-out foot creates a wider platform to launch off and land on, allowing dancers to jump higher, bettering this natural movement. It's also important to note the role of point shoes within the theory of verisimilitude. Originally, point shoes were much softer than today's bricks disguised as shoes, and they were used for only a second at a time. Marie Taglioni was the first dancer to dance a full-length ballet on point. This incorporation of point work was meant to create the illusion of flying. Again, ballet is taking what we understand to be reality and adjusting it to present visions of worlds more beautiful than our own. And even though we now incorporate point work much more frequently, the notion of representing an ethereal being is still a concept used today. This brings us to the idea of ballet as a storytelling device within the frame of our theory. While what we now consider to be classics were mostly developed during the height of the theory of realism in the 19th century, these ballets continued on the path of beautifying and perfecting reality through their stories. For starters, many of these ballets consist of otherworldly characters such as the dryads in Don Quixote, the sylphs in La Sylphide, and the fairies in Sleeping Beauty, just to name a few. These roles are often characterized as graceful and disconnected from human struggles and flaws, and these ballets tell stories of worlds that initially resemble our own, but eventually deviate from accuracy and incorporate beautified images of reality, one where beautiful fairies really do exist. In addition to the commitment that classical ballets have to the idealization of reality through their stories, this time period also made space for the furthering of the beautification and perfection of ballet technique by highlighting its unnatural physical demands. Here we begin to see the normalization of the performative 32 fouettes, hops on point, and incredibly athletic jumps. From 1 second on point to create the illusion of flying, to spending 32 consecutive counts on the shoe's platform while traveling across a stage, ballet is now pushing the physical limits of the human body with the desire to better the image of human movement. Deviating away from imitating otherworldly movement, the bettering of natural movement through ballet is now being presented through the physical feats that typical people cannot do. This newly incorporated athleticism, in conjunction with the art form's norm to portray everything as effortless, lends a hand in the perfecting of ballet aesthetics. The movement, and by extension the dancers, are considered beautiful and more than human, better than the real world. As we enter the 20th century, we begin to see a change in the choreographic and story preferences of ballet. Ballet began to move away from valuing storytelling and began to value movement as a form of expression and its visual aesthetic quality. This raised the question of what movement is now considered visually pleasing. Choreographers such as Václav Nijinsky and George Balanchine began to reject explicit stories in favor of emotional expression through movement and its relation to music. At this time, the art world was becoming very experimental, with many critics and supporters of avant-garde movements which stepped away from the traditional values of realism. One supporter of these expressionist movements was the theorist Ernst Bloch. Bloch made an interesting argument about these experimental works using his contemporary Georg Lukács's idea of reification. Reification refers to the process in our society to feel the world as thing-like, or an objective reality that can only be contemplated. Bloch believed that expressionist and expressionist-like movements make this reification very clear for viewers. Fragmented imagery, and in ballet's case, the combination of the piece's progression without a story and specific movement quality, lets the audience more clearly see how we view our world through disconnected moments or parts. Bloch also argued that this effect often reflects on the nature of our social world without feeling a need to act upon it. This can be seen in newer ballet works. More than ever, the choreography values the feelings and worldly understanding that it can evoke from an audience. 21st century choreographers like Wayne McGregor, Miles Thatcher, and Justin Peck create works heavily inspired by observations of society, human relationships, and emotional responses. Many of these works also place the responsibility to understand the implicit meaning of the piece on the audience, much like many modernists of the 20th century. But oftentimes, a meaning or an understanding of the mimesis is not necessary for the audience. As Aristotle argued in his Poetics, mimetic works allow an audience to experience a feeling of catharsis. These modern works create room for this experience, as they value the emotional responses that dance can evoke. Modern ballets also stray from its traditional roots of beautifying the natural by reverting back to more pedestrian movements. Justin Peck even creates ballets in sneakers. This deviation emphasizes this new emotional value in ballet. Connecting with a large audience and provoking certain emotions through a more subjective and intimate form of expression is becoming increasingly preferred in the art form instead of its classical roots of idealization and perfection. While many choreographers continue to experiment with ballet's boundaries, there is still a high regard for classical works and their beautification. Many companies often perform a mixed repertoire of classical and contemporary works within a single season. But at the end of the day, all of them have something unique and beautiful to offer an audience.